My husband left his empire to me. My stepson sued, claiming I was an uneducated housewife who manipulated him. He hired the city's top lawyer to destroy me. As I entered the courtroom, the opposing lawyer turned pale, dropped his briefcase, and bowed. "It's really you! I can't believe it!" Stepson had no idea who I truly was. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Marcia. I'm 67 years old, and today I learned what it feels like to be called just a housewife in a courtroom full of strangers." The morning started like any other since Richard's death 6 months ago. I made my coffee in the same ceramic mug he bought me for our 15th anniversary, sat at the kitchen table where we'd shared 20 years of breakfasts, and tried to pretend the silence didn't suffocate me. The house felt too big now, too quiet, filled with memories that both comforted and tormented me. Then the doorbell rang. The young man in the cheap suit handed me an envelope with the kind of formal politeness that immediately put me on edge. "Mrs. Stone? Legal documents? You'll need to sign here." My hands trembled as I read the papers. Trevor, my stepson, was contesting Richard's will. According to the documents, I had manipulated his father into leaving me everything. The words undue influence jumped off the page like accusations. Gold digger. Opportunist. Took advantage of an elderly man's diminished capacity. I sank into Richard's old leather chair, the one where he used to read his evening newspaper, and felt the world shift beneath my feet. 20 years of marriage, 20 years of caring for this family, and this was how it ended. The courthouse smelled of old wood polish and broken dreams. I walked through those marble hallways in my simple navy dress, the same one I'd worn to Richard's funeral, clutching my small purse like a lifeline. Every step echoed in the vast space, making me feel smaller and more insignificant with each sound. Trevor was already there when I arrived, sitting at a polished mahogany table that probably cost more than most people's cars. He wore a charcoal suit that screamed money, his dark hair slicked back, and that familiar smirk I'd grown to despise over the years. Next to him sat his lawyer, Jonathan Pierce, whose reputation preceded him like a warning. $300 an hour, they said. The best money could buy. I had no lawyer. I couldn't afford one, not really. Not without dipping into the inheritance that Trevor was trying to steal from me. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and Judge Hamilton entered the courtroom. He was younger than I expected, maybe 55, with graying temples and the kind of serious expression that comes from years of listening to people's worst moments. The proceedings began with Jonathan Pierce's opening statement. His voice was smooth, practiced, the kind that could make lies sound like gospel truth. "Your Honor, we're here today because an innocent man's final wishes have been perverted by a calculating woman who saw opportunity in an aging widower's loneliness." I felt the blood drain from my face. Around me, the few spectators in the courtroom murmured their disapproval. Pierce continued, painting me as a predator who'd swooped in to steal from Richard's real family. "Mrs. Stone," he said, my name dripping with disdain, "married the deceased after a suspiciously brief courtship. She has no children of her own, no career to speak of, no independent source of income. She was, by all accounts, nothing more than a housewife entirely dependent on my client's father for financial support." Trevor leaned back in his chair, that same arrogant expression he'd worn since he was 12 years old, and I'd first married his father. I remembered trying to bond with him then, making his favorite pancakes on Saturday mornings, helping with homework he didn't want help with, attending school plays where he pretended not to see me in the audience. Furthermore, Pierce continued, Mrs. Stone isolated the deceased from his son, poisoning their relationship and ensuring her position as sole beneficiary of an estate worth $8,500,000. The number hung in the air like an accusation. I'd never thought of Richard's money as mine. It was just there, like the air we breathed, the foundation that allowed us to live comfortably while I took care of him, of our home, of the life we'd built together. Judge Hamilton leaned forward. "And what evidence do you have of this alleged manipulation, Mr. Pierce?" "We have documentation showing that Mrs. Stone actively discouraged my client from visiting his father during the final years of his life. Phone records, witness statements from neighbors who observed her controlling behavior." I wanted to stand up and scream. Those discouraged visits were because Trevor only came around when he needed money. Those phone records showed me trying to reach Trevor when his father was dying, begging him to come home one last time. But how do you prove love? How do you demonstrate 20 years of caring for someone in a language the law understands? Pierce gestured toward me dismissively. "Your Honor, we're dealing with a classic case of elder abuse. A woman with no marketable skills, no education beyond high school, who latched onto a vulnerable man and systematically turned him against his only child." That's when Trevor spoke for the first time. "She is just a housewife," he laughed, the sound echoing off the courtroom walls like a slap. "Your Honor, look at her. She can barely manage her own finances, let alone understand the complexity of my father's estate. She probably doesn't even know what half those assets are worth." The courtroom fell silent except for Trevor's chuckling. Judge Hamilton's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes when he looked at me. "Mrs. Stone, do you have legal representation?" I stood slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me. "No, Your Honor. I'm representing myself." "I see." He made a note on his papers. "And what is your response to these allegations?" My throat felt dry as sandpaper. 20 years of morning coffee and evening wine, of birthday dinners and anniversary celebrations, of holding Richard's hand through 2 surgeries and countless doctor's appointments. How do you compress a life into legal terminology? Your Honor, I loved my husband. Everything I did was to take care of him, to make him happy. I never asked for his money. I never even wanted it. Trevor snorted. Right. That's why you married a man 23 years older than you. I married Richard because he was kind, I said, my voice growing stronger despite the tremor in my hands. Because he treated me with respect. Because after my first marriage ended, he showed me what real love looked like. Pierce shuffled through his papers. Your Honor, we can produce witnesses who will testify that Mrs. Stone frequently made comments about inheriting the deceased's wealth. Her own neighbor heard her discussing the will just weeks before his death. Mrs. Chen. My stomach dropped. She'd caught me crying on the front porch after Richard's diagnosis, when the doctor told us he had maybe 6 months. I'd been terrified, not of losing the money, but of losing him, of being alone again. But how would that sound in a courtroom? Judge Hamilton glanced at his watch. We'll adjourn for today and reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Mrs. Stone, I strongly advise you to consider obtaining legal counsel. As the courtroom emptied, I remained seated, watching Trevor and Pierce shake hands and laugh about something I couldn't hear. The weight of the day pressed down on me like a physical force. I'd been dismissed, diminished, reduced to nothing more than a gold-digging housewife in a cheap dress. But as I finally stood to leave, something inside me began to stir. Something that had been sleeping for 20 years, buried beneath casseroles and PTA meetings and anniversary parties. Something that remembered who I used to be before I became Richard's wife. Trevor thought he knew me. Pierce thought he could destroy me with a few well-placed accusations. They had no idea who they were really dealing with. That evening, I sat in Richard's study surrounded by the ghosts of our life together. The walls were lined with law books, his collection from his days as a corporate attorney, and photographs from our travels. Venice, Paris, the cabin in Vermont where we spent our last anniversary. Everything felt fragile now, as if Trevor's accusations had the power to erase 20 years of happiness. I poured myself a glass of the Merlot Richard had been saving for a special occasion that never came, and tried to make sense of what had happened in that courtroom. The way Trevor had looked at me, like I was something dirty he'd stepped in. The way Pierce had dismissed me as if I were nothing. Just a housewife, I whispered to the empty room, and the words tasted bitter. But I wasn't always just a housewife, was I? My fingers traced the spines of those law books, remembering when I'd had my own collection. When I'd worn power suits instead of aprons. When people stood when I entered a room. That life felt like a dream now, buried so deeply I sometimes wondered if I'd imagined it all. The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but I answered anyway. Mrs. Stone, this is Jennifer Walsh from Channel 7 News. I understand you're involved in a high-profile inheritance dispute. Would you be willing to comment on the allegations that you manipulated your late husband? I hung up without a word, but the phone rang again immediately. Then again. By the fourth call, I disconnected it entirely. Somehow, word had gotten out. Tomorrow, I'd probably see my face on the morning news, portrayed as the wicked stepmother who'd stolen a dying man's fortune. I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, my bedroom now, and caught sight of myself in the mirror. Gray hair pulled back in a simple bun, face lined with years of laughter and worry, wearing the same style of modest dress I'd worn for the past 2 decades. I looked exactly like what Trevor had called me, just a housewife. But as I opened the jewelry box on my dresser to put away my wedding ring for the night, my fingers found something else. Hidden beneath the velvet lining was a small key I'd forgotten about. The key to Richard's desk drawer, the one he'd always kept locked. For emergencies, he'd said when he gave it to me years ago. When you need to remember who you really are. I'd never understood what he meant. Until now. Back in the study, my hands trembling with something between fear and anticipation, I slid the key into the lock. The drawer opened with a soft click, revealing a manila folder marked Marcia Personal. Inside were documents I hadn't seen in 20 years. My law degree from Harvard, summa cum laude. Newspaper clippings from my early career. A photograph of me being sworn in as the youngest Superior Court judge in the state's history. Letters of recommendation from legal giants whose names still carried weight in courtrooms across the country. And at the bottom of the pile, a handwritten note from Richard. My dearest Marcia, I know you sacrificed everything to build a life with me, but your talents were never wasted. They were just sleeping, waiting for the day you'd need them again. You are the strongest, most brilliant woman I've ever known. Don't let anyone, not even our son, convince you otherwise. All my love, Richard. The tears came then, hot and overwhelming. Richard had known. He'd always known who I really was, what I'd given up for love. And he'd protected that secret, kept it safe until I was ready to reclaim it. I'd been Judge Margaret Stone for 15 years before I became Mrs. Richard Stone. I'd presided over complex civil cases, corporate litigation, criminal trials that made headlines. I'd earned a reputation as the Iron Judge, brilliant, incorruptible, feared by lawyers who came unprepared to my courtroom. But when I met Richard at a charity gala in 2003, something shifted. He was recently widowed, struggling to raise 12-year-old Trevor alone. He didn't know who I was professionally. To him, I was just Marcia, the woman who made him laugh for the first time since his wife's death. For the first time in my career, I'd found something more important than the law. A man who loved me for who I was, not what I'd achieved. A broken family that needed healing. A chance to be someone's wife. Maybe even someone's mother. So, I'd made a choice. I took early retirement, citing burnout, and quietly stepped away from the legal world that had defined me for so long. I became Mrs. Richard Stone, stepmother to a grieving boy who resented my presence, but desperately needed stability. 20 years of PTA meetings and school plays and family dinners. 20 years of being the woman behind the successful man, supporting Richard's career while mine became a footnote in legal journals. I'd told myself it was worth it, that love was worth any sacrifice. But as I sat in that study, surrounded by the evidence of who I used to be, I realized something had been burning inside me all day. Not just anger at Trevor's accusations, but something fiercer. Something that remembered what it felt like to command a courtroom, to make lawyers twice my age scramble for precedents they couldn't find. I pulled out my laptop. Richard had insisted I learn to use it, though I'd mostly stuck to email and online shopping, and did something I hadn't done in 20 years. I researched case law, inheritance disputes, undue influence, burden of proof. My fingers moved across the keyboard with muscle memory I didn't know I still possessed, navigating legal databases like I'd never left. The law had changed in some ways over the past 2 decades, but the fundamentals remained the same. And Trevor's case? It was weaker than tissue paper. Pierce was relying on emotional manipulation and circumstantial evidence. He had no proof of coercion, no documentation of diminished capacity, no witnesses to any actual wrongdoing. What he had was a grieving son's resentment and a jury's potential sympathy for a young man who felt cheated out of his inheritance. But sympathy doesn't win cases. Evidence does. And I was beginning to remember exactly how to find it. I spent the rest of the night in that study, reading through Richard's papers with eyes that hadn't seen them in 20 years, not as a wife, but as a lawyer. The will was ironclad, witnessed and notarized properly. Richard's medical records showed no signs of dementia or cognitive decline. His financial advisor had detailed notes about their discussions regarding the inheritance, including Richard's specific concerns about Trevor's spending habits and lack of responsibility. More importantly, I found Richard's private journal from his final months. Page after page of entries expressing his love for me, his gratitude for our life together, and his growing disappointment in Trevor's behavior. The last entry, dated just a week before his death, made me catch my breath. Marcia doesn't know I've seen her old courtroom photos, hidden in that box in the closet. She thinks she gave up everything for me, but she has no idea how proud I am of what she accomplished. If anything happens to me, I know Trevor will try to hurt her. He's never forgiven her for taking his mother's place in my heart. But my Marcia is stronger than she knows. She's forgotten what she's capable of, but I haven't. She's going to surprise everyone. I closed the journal and looked around the study with new eyes. This wasn't just Richard's space. It had been mine too, long before I'd ever met him. And tomorrow, when I walked back into that courtroom, I wouldn't be walking in as just a housewife. I would be walking in as Judge Margaret Stone. Trevor thought he could intimidate me with his expensive lawyer and his accusations. He thought I was nothing more than the woman who'd cooked his dinner and washed his clothes for 20 years. He was about to learn how wrong he'd been about everything. The second day in court arrived with a crispness that matched my newfound resolve. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing the same navy dress from the day before, but this time I carried myself differently. My spine was straighter, my steps more measured. I was still playing the role of the grieving housewife, but underneath, something had awakened. Trevor and Pierce were already at their table when I arrived, deep in conversation over stacks of papers. Pierce looked confident, almost bored, like a man who'd already won. Trevor wore that same smirk, occasionally glancing my way as if I were an amusing sideshow. Judge Hamilton entered promptly at 9 o'clock, and I noticed something I'd missed yesterday. The way he carried himself, the careful precision of his movements. He reminded me of the young attorneys who used to appear in my courtroom, the ones who'd studied every case precedent and still trembled when they stood to speak. "Mr. Pierce," Judge Hamilton said, "you may call your first witness." "Thank you, Your Honor. I'd like to call Mrs. Elizabeth Chen to the stand." My stomach clenched as my neighbor took the oath. Mrs. Chen had lived next door for 8 years, always polite but distant. I'd helped her with groceries after her hip surgery, brought her soup when she had the flu. But as she settled into the witness chair, she wouldn't meet my eyes. Pierce approached her with the practiced ease of a predator who'd cornered his prey. "Mrs. Chen, how well did you know the deceased, Richard Stone?" "Pretty well. He was a good neighbor, very kind man." "And his relationship with his son, Trevor?" Mrs. Chen shifted uncomfortably. "Well, I didn't see Trevor visit very often in the last few years." Did Mrs. Stone ever discuss this with you? Sometimes. Her voice was barely above a whisper. She seemed frustrated by it. Pierce nodded encouragingly. Can you tell the court about a specific conversation you had with Mrs. Stone regarding the inheritance? My heart hammered against my ribs. I knew what was coming. It was about 2 months before Richard died. I found her crying on her front porch. She was upset about his diagnosis, the cancer, you know. And she said, Mrs. Chen paused, glancing at me with what looked like guilt. She said she was scared of what would happen to her when he was gone, that she'd given up everything for him, and Trevor would probably try to take it all away from her. The courtroom was dead silent. Pierce let the words hang in the air like smoke. Did she mention the will specifically? She said Richard had promised to take care of her, but she was worried Trevor wouldn't honor that promise. Pierce smiled. No further questions. Judge Hamilton looked at me. Mrs. Stone, do you wish to cross-examine the witness? I stood slowly, my legs steadier than they'd been yesterday. Something was stirring in my chest. Not panic, but calculation. Yes, Your Honor. I approached Mrs. Chen, noting how she flinched slightly. Poor woman. She had no idea she was about to become my first piece of evidence that things weren't what they seemed. Mrs. Chen, you testified that I was crying on my porch when we had this conversation. Can you tell the court why I was crying? She blinked, clearly not expecting this question. Because Richard was dying? Specifically, what had I just learned that day? Pierce started to object, but Judge Hamilton waved him off. I'll allow it. Mrs. Chen looked confused. The doctor had told you both that morning that the treatments weren't working, that he had maybe 6 weeks left. 6 weeks, I repeated, letting the words settle. Mrs. Chen, in your opinion, was I crying because my husband was dying, or because I was worried about money? Because he was dying, she said immediately, then looked stricken as she realized what she'd admitted. And when I mentioned being scared of what would happen when he was gone, did I say I was scared of being poor? Or did I say I was scared of being alone? Mrs. Chen's voice was barely audible. You said you were scared of being alone, that you didn't know how to live without him. I nodded. Thank you, Mrs. Chen. No further questions. As she left the witness stand, I caught Judge Hamilton watching me with renewed interest. There had been something in my questioning, a precision, a control, that didn't match the image of a helpless housewife. Pierce called 2 more witnesses, Richard's banker, who testified about the large sums of money Richard had moved around in his final months, and a former colleague who claimed Richard had seemed confused during their last conversation. But with each witness, I grew more confident. The banker admitted under my cross-examination that Richard had been reorganizing his finances to make them easier for me to manage after his death. A thoughtful gesture, not evidence of manipulation. The colleague conceded that Richard's confusion was actually frustration with his former law firm's handling of a client's case. By lunch break, I could see doubt creeping into Pierce's expression. Trevor, however, remained smugly confident. You're doing better than expected, Judge Hamilton said quietly as we prepared to recess. But I have to ask, Mrs. Stone, what's your full legal name? The question hit me like electricity. I'm sorry, Your Honor. For the court records, your full legal name. My mouth went dry. This was it, the moment I'd been both dreading and anticipating. Margaret Stone, Your Honor, but I go by Marcia. Judge Hamilton's pen froze over his notepad. His eyes snapped up to mine, and I saw the exact moment recognition dawned. Margaret Stone, he repeated slowly. As in, Judge Margaret Stone? The courtroom went deadly silent. Trevor's head whipped around to stare at me. Pierce's confident expression cracked like thin ice. I was Judge Margaret Stone, I said quietly. I retired 20 years ago. Trevor shot to his feet. What? That's impossible. You're just a housewife, I finished for him. Yes, I heard you yesterday. Pierce was frantically whispering to Trevor, both of them looking like they'd seen a ghost. Judge Hamilton was staring at me with something approaching awe. Your Honor, Pierce said, his voice strained. This is the first we're hearing of any legal background. We request time to— To what? Judge Hamilton's voice was sharp. To research the woman you've been calling an uneducated gold digger? Mr. Pierce, did you not investigate the background of the opposing party? Pierce's face had gone pale. We conducted standard background checks, Your Honor. There was no indication of any legal career. Because I took my husband's name and retired from public life, I said simply. But my bar membership is still active. I've kept up with continuing education requirements. I am, in fact, qualified to represent myself in this matter. The weight of what was happening began to settle over the courtroom. Trevor looked like he was about to be sick. Pierce was shuffling through papers as if he could find some magic solution to the disaster unfolding before him. But Judge Hamilton was looking at me with the kind of respect I hadn't seen in 20 years. Judge Stone, he said formally. I had the honor of appearing before your court several times as a young attorney. You were formidable. A small smile tugged at my lips. I tried to be fair, Your Honor. You were both fair and brilliant. He turned to Pierce. Mr. Pierce, I suggest you use the lunch recess to reconsider your strategy. Court will reconvene at 2 o'clock. As the courtroom emptied, I remained seated, feeling the transformation that was taking place inside me. The mask I'd worn for 20 years was beginning to slip, and underneath, Judge Margaret Stone was waking up. Trevor approached my table, his face twisted with rage and confusion. This is impossible. You can't be a judge. Judges don't just become housewives. I looked up at him, really looked at him, for the first time in years. Not as his stepmother, not as the woman who'd tried so hard to earn his love, but as the judge who'd spent 15 years sizing up liars and manipulators. Some of us, I said quietly, chose love over power, Trevor. But that doesn't mean we forgot how to fight when we need to. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Behind him, Pierce was making frantic phone calls, probably trying to figure out how badly they'd just miscalculated. As I gathered my things to leave for lunch, I felt lighter than I had in months. The grief was still there. I would always miss Richard. But underneath it was something I'd thought was gone forever. The thrill of the hunt. The satisfaction of watching a weak case crumble under scrutiny. Judge Margaret Stone was back, and she was ready for war. The afternoon session felt different from the moment I walked back into that courtroom. Word had spread during the lunch break. I could see it in the way people looked at me, in the hushed conversations that stopped when I passed. The local legal community was small, and apparently, the return of Judge Margaret Stone was news. Trevor sat slumped in his chair like a deflated balloon. Pierce kept glancing at me with the expression of a man who'd just realized he'd brought a knife to a gunfight. But it was Judge Hamilton's demeanor that had changed most dramatically. Where yesterday he'd looked at me with polite sympathy, now there was something approaching deference in his eyes. Before we proceed, Judge Hamilton said once court was in session, I want to address what was revealed this morning. Mrs. Stone, I need to ask, are you planning to continue representing yourself or will you be seeking counsel? I stood, and for the first time in 20 years, I felt the full weight of my professional authority settle around my shoulders like a familiar coat. I will continue representing myself, Your Honor. I believe I'm adequately qualified. A ripple of quiet laughter went through the courtroom. Judge Hamilton's lips twitched. I think that's safe to say. Mr. Pierce, do you wish to continue with your case as planned? Pierce looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor, but he nodded. Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to call Trevor Stone to the stand. This would be interesting. I'd watched Trevor lie to his father, to teachers, to girlfriends, and to himself for 20 years. But he'd never been cross-examined by someone who'd spent 15 years spotting deception from the bench. Trevor took the oath with all the swagger he could muster, but I could see the nervousness in the way he kept glancing at me. Pierce led him through his testimony carefully. The distant relationship with his father, the sudden marriage to a much younger woman, the isolation he claimed to have experienced. "In your opinion," Pierce asked, "did Mrs. Stone deliberately interfere with your relationship with your father?" "Absolutely," Trevor said, his confidence returning as he warmed to his favorite subject, himself. "She was always there, always hovering, making it clear I wasn't welcome in my own father's house." "Can you give the court a specific example?" Trevor's eyes lit up. "Last Christmas, I came to visit for 3 days, and she made sure every minute was scheduled with her activities. Shopping, dinner parties with her friends, holiday movies she wanted to watch. When I tried to have a private conversation with my dad, she'd always interrupt with something that supposedly couldn't wait." Pierce nodded sympathetically. "How did this make you feel?" "Like she was deliberately keeping me from my father. Like she was afraid of what he might say if we were alone together." It was a compelling story, delivered with just the right amount of wounded emotion. If I'd still been the grieving housewife from yesterday morning, it might have devastated me. But I wasn't her anymore. "Mr. Pierce," Judge Hamilton said, "your witness." I stood and approached Trevor with measured steps. He tried to maintain his confident expression, but I could see the first cracks forming. "Trevor," I said, my voice carrying the authority I'd forgotten I possessed, "you testified that you came to visit your father last Christmas for 3 days. Is that correct?" "Yes. And before that visit, when was the last time you'd seen your father?" Trevor shifted in his seat. "I don't remember exactly." "Let me help refresh your memory." I pulled out a document from the folder I'd compiled the night before. "According to your father's calendar, which he kept meticulously, your last visit before Christmas was 14 months earlier. Does that sound accurate?" "Maybe. We talked on the phone." "How often?" "Another shift. Regularly." "Trevor, I'm going to show you your father's phone records, which are part of his estate documents." I handed him a paper. "Can you tell the court how many times you called your father in the 6 months before his death?" He stared at the paper, his face flushing. "These might not be complete." "They are complete, Trevor. The answer is 3 times. 3 calls in 6 months, each lasting less than 10 minutes. Does that match your definition of regularly?" Pierce was on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Mrs. Stone is testifying rather than questioning." "Sustained," Judge Hamilton said, but there was no disapproval in his voice. "Please rephrase, Mrs. Stone." I smiled slightly. It had been 20 years, but the rhythm of courtroom combat was coming back to me like riding a bicycle. "Trevor, based on these phone records, would you say you were in close, regular contact with your father?" "We had a complicated relationship," he said defensively. "Indeed. Now you testified that I scheduled activities to prevent you from having private conversations with your father. Do you recall what those activities were?" "Shopping, dinner parties, movies." "Specifically, Trevor, what shopping?" He looked confused. "I don't remember." "The shopping was for your father's medications, which required a special trip to a pharmacy 30 miles away because they were the only ones who could compound his pain medication properly. The dinner parties were actually one dinner party, a surprise celebration for your father's 70th birthday, which you'd forgotten about until I reminded you. And the movies were films from the 1940s that your father loved but could barely hear without the volume turned up extremely loud. Were you aware that your father had severe hearing loss in his final months?" Trevor's mouth opened and closed. No. "So when you interpreted my presence during your conversations as interference, is it possible I was actually helping your father hear what you were saying?" The courtroom was completely silent now. I could see the jurors. Yes, we'd somehow ended up with a jury trial, Pierce's mistake, leaning forward with interest. "And Trevor," I continued, my voice softening just slightly. You mentioned being made to feel unwelcome in your father's house. When you arrived for that Christmas visit, where did you sleep? In my old room. The room I'd spent 3 weeks preparing for your visit? The one where I'd hung your high school baseball trophies and put out fresh flowers and your favorite snacks. His face was bright red now. I don't remember. Let me ask you directly, Trevor. In all the years I was married to your father, did I ever, even once, ask you not to visit? Did I ever tell you that you weren't welcome? No, but did I ever refuse to cook your favorite meals when you came home? No. Did I ever fail to include you in family photographs, holiday celebrations, or important events? No. His voice was barely audible. Trevor, is it possible that your feelings about our relationship had more to do with your grief over your mother's death than with anything I actually did or didn't do? Pierce shot to his feet again. Objection. Mrs. Stone is not qualified to make psychological evaluations. I turned to Judge Hamilton with the ghost of a smile. Withdrawn, Your Honor. I'll rephrase. Trevor, when you were 12 years old and I first married your father, what did you call me? Trevor looked like he wanted to disappear. I don't remember. You called me the replacement, I said quietly. And later, when your father asked you to try to be kinder to me, you said, and I quote, "She'll never be my real mom, so why should I pretend to like her?" And the silence in the courtroom was deafening. I could see tears in several jurors' eyes. Trevor, I'm not trying to humiliate you, but I need this court to understand that I spent 20 years trying to earn your love, not trying to steal your father's. I never asked him to choose between us. I simply asked him to let me love you both. Trevor was crying now, ugly, gasping sobs that shook his whole body. You don't understand, he choked out. He loved you more than he ever loved me, more than he loved my mother. I could see it every time he looked at you. And there it was, the truth that had been festering for 20 years. Trevor, I said gently, love isn't a finite resource. Your father's love for me didn't diminish his love for you. It just made our family bigger. Judge Hamilton was watching this exchange with something approaching wonder. Pierce looked like he wanted to crawl under his table and disappear. But Trevor, you're not here because you miss your father or because you feel unloved. You're here because you want his money. So let me ask you one final question. In the week before your father died, when I called you 6 times begging you to come say goodbye, why didn't you come? Trevor's sobs intensified. I was busy. I had work. You were in Las Vegas, Trevor, with your girlfriend, gambling with money your father had given you the month before for your rent. Pierce was frantically shuffling papers, probably looking for some way to object, but what could he say? These were facts, documented and verifiable. While your father was dying, asking for you every day, wondering why his son wouldn't come home, you were at poker tables losing the last money he would ever give you. I let that settle for a moment, watching the jury absorb the full weight of what they were hearing. So when you stand before this court and claim that I manipulated your father, that I stole your inheritance, that I turned him against you, I want you to remember that you did all of that yourself. I just loved him enough to hold his hand while he waited for a son who never came home. Trevor collapsed completely, his whole body shaking with the force of his grief and shame. Judge Hamilton called for a brief recess, but the damage was done. As the courtroom emptied, Pierce approached my table with the look of a man facing his own execution. Judge Stone, he said quietly, I think we may need to discuss a settlement. I looked up at him with the cold precision that had once made seasoned attorneys break into nervous sweats. Mr. Pierce, 24 hours ago you called me an uneducated housewife who manipulated a dying man. You questioned my intelligence, my integrity, and my right to be loved. Now you want to settle? He swallowed hard. Perhaps we were overzealous in our initial approach. Perhaps, I agreed. But I'm not interested in settling anymore. I'm interested in justice, and I'm very, very good at getting it." As Pierce walked away, I felt the last vestiges of the grieving housewife fall away completely. Judge Margaret Stone had returned, and she was ready to finish what they'd started. The next morning brought an unseasonable chill to the courthouse steps, but I felt warmer than I had in months. Word of yesterday's revelation had spread through the legal community overnight. As I walked through the marble hallways, I caught whispered conversations that stopped when I passed, respectful nods from attorneys I didn't recognize, and something I hadn't experienced in 20 years, the electric atmosphere that surrounds a courtroom legend. Trevor looked haggard when I entered the courtroom, his expensive suit wrinkled, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he'd spent the night wrestling with demons he'd kept buried for 2 decades. Pierce sat beside him like a man attending his own funeral, frantically scribbling notes on a yellow legal pad that seemed to offer no salvation. Judge Hamilton entered with the bearing of someone who knew he was about to witness legal history. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "before we continue, I want to address the elephant in the room. Yesterday we learned that Mrs. Stone is actually retired Superior Court Judge Margaret Stone, known throughout the legal community for her brilliant jurisprudence and uncompromising integrity. Mr. Pierce, do you wish to make any motions before we proceed?" Pierce stood slowly, his earlier arrogance replaced by something resembling humility. "Your Honor, we move to dismiss all charges of manipulation and undue influence. We acknowledge that we may have been overzealous in our initial assessment of Mrs. Stone's character and capabilities." I felt a cold smile tugging at my lips. 24 hours ago, this would have been victory enough. But something had changed during the long night I'd spent preparing for this moment. This wasn't just about the inheritance anymore. It was about justice for every woman who'd ever been dismissed, diminished, or called just a housewife. I stood before Pierce could sit down. "Your Honor, I object to the dismissal." Judge Hamilton raised an eyebrow. "Mrs. Stone, the plaintiff is attempting to withdraw their case in your favor. You're objecting to winning?" "I'm objecting to settling for less than the full truth, Your Honor. Mr. Pierce and his client have made serious allegations about my character, my competence, and my fitness to inherit my late husband's estate. I believe this court, and the public record, deserves to hear all the evidence before we conclude these proceedings." I could see understanding dawning in Judge Hamilton's eyes. He'd been a young attorney when I was on the bench, and he remembered my reputation for thorough, uncompromising justice. "Very well," he said. "Mrs. Stone, you may present your case." I had spent the entire night preparing for this moment, and I was ready. "Your Honor, I call Richard Stone to testify." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Pierce shot to his feet. "Objection, the witness is deceased." "Not Richard Stone himself, Mr. Pierce." Richard Stone's voice, preserved in video testimony he recorded 3 months before his death, specifically in case his will was ever contested. The silence that followed was deafening. Trevor's face went white as I approached the bailiff with a tablet containing the video file I'd found hidden in Richard's computer files the night before. "Your Honor," I said, "my husband was a meticulous man who understood human nature better than most. He knew that his son might challenge this will, and he wanted his own voice to speak from beyond the grave." The courtroom's attention focused on the large screen as Richard's face appeared, gaunt from his illness but his eyes still sharp with intelligence and determination. "My name is Richard Stone," his recorded voice began, "and I am of sound mind and body as I record this on March 15th, 2024. I am creating this testimony because I fear that after my death, my son Trevor will attempt to contest my will and vilify my beloved wife Marcia in the process." Trevor slumped in his chair as his father's voice filled the courtroom with an authority that death couldn't diminish. "Let me be clear about several things. First, I was never manipulated, coerced, or unduly influenced by Marcia. Every decision I made regarding my estate was mine alone, made with full knowledge of my son's character and behavior patterns that I observed over 35 years of his life." Richard's image leaned forward slightly, his gaze seeming to look directly at Trevor through the screen. Trevor, if you're watching this, I want you to know that I loved you. I always loved you. But love doesn't blind a parent to their child's failings. You are irresponsible with money. I've bailed you out of debt 17 times in the past 10 years. You are unable to maintain steady employment despite every advantage I've given you. And most painfully, you have shown nothing but contempt for the woman who tried to love you like her own son. I watched Trevor's face crumble as 20 years of denial crashed down around him. Marcia sacrificed more for our family than you'll ever understand, Richard continued. She was Judge Margaret Stone, one of the most respected jurists in this state's history. She gave up a career that most lawyers only dream of because she loved me and wanted to build a life with us. She cooked your meals, attended your games, helped with your homework, and endured your cruelty with patience I didn't deserve. The courtroom was completely silent, except for the soft sound of Trevor's weeping. I am leaving my estate to Marcia, not because she manipulated me, but because she earned it through 20 years of unwavering devotion. She nursed me through 2 surgeries, held my hand through chemotherapy, and never once complained about the burden I became in my final months. She deserves every penny, and she deserves to live her remaining years in the comfort and security that her sacrifices have earned. Richard's voice softened slightly. Trevor, I pray that someday you'll understand that your anger toward Marcia was never really about her. It was about losing your mother and being afraid to let anyone else love you. But that's not Marcia's fault, and it's not her responsibility to pay for your inability to heal. The video ended, leaving the courtroom in stunned silence. I could see jurors wiping their eyes, court reporters looking shaken, even the bailiff standing a little straighter out of respect for what they'd just witnessed. Judge Hamilton cleared his throat. Mr. Pierce, do you wish to cross-examine this testimony? Pierce looked like he'd aged 10 years in the span of 20 minutes. No, Your Honor. No questions. Mrs. Stone, do you have additional evidence to present? I moved to my table and lifted a thick folder I'd compiled during my sleepless night. Yes, Your Honor. I have documentation showing that Trevor Stone has borrowed approximately $137,000 from his father over the past 15 years, none of which has been repaid. I have records showing that he was asked to leave 3 different jobs for excessive absences and unprofessional conduct. And I have witnesses who can testify to his pattern of appearing at his father's home only when he needed money. I paused, letting the weight of evidence settle over the courtroom like dust after an explosion. But more importantly, Your Honor, I have this. I held up Richard's private journal, the one I'd found in his locked drawer. My husband's personal thoughts and feelings about his relationship with his son, recorded over the final year of his life. Thoughts that show not manipulation, but heartbreak. Not undue influence, but a father's desperate hope that his son would someday grow into the man he'd raised him to be. Trevor was openly sobbing now, his shoulders shaking with the force of 20 years' worth of suppressed grief and guilt. Your Honor, I said, my voice carrying the authority of both my legal training and my personal pain. This case was never about money. It was about a young man who couldn't accept that his father loved his stepmother, not instead of him, but alongside him. It was about grief turned to greed, and entitlement masquerading as injustice. I turned to face Trevor directly. I tried to love you for 20 years, Trevor. I failed, but not for lack of trying. Your father left me his estate because he knew I would honor his memory and protect what he built. You're challenging that not because you were wronged, but because you feel wronged. And there's a difference. Judge Hamilton leaned forward. Mrs. Stone, what are you asking this court to do? I took a deep breath, feeling the full weight of my professional authority settling around me like armor. I'm asking this court to uphold Richard Stone's will in its entirety. I'm asking for a judgment that removes any cloud from my inheritance. And I'm asking that Trevor Stone be ordered to repay the $137,000 he borrowed from his father's estate over the years, with appropriate interest. The gasp that went up from the courtroom was audible. Pierce shot to his feet. Your Honor, that's not part of this case. It is now, I said calmly. Trevor opened this door when he claimed I was financially exploiting his father. I'm simply asking for an accounting of all financial exploitation that occurred in this family. Judge Hamilton looked at Trevor with something approaching pity. Mr. Stone, how do you respond to these allegations? Trevor could barely speak through his tears. I don't have that kind of money. I can't pay it back. Then perhaps, I said quietly, you shouldn't have borrowed it in the first place. The silence that followed felt like the end of the world, and in many ways it was. The end of Trevor's world of entitlement and denial, the end of his fantasy that he was the wronged party in this family's story. Judge Hamilton spent several minutes reviewing his notes before he spoke. When he finally looked up, his expression was grave. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he said, you've heard extraordinary testimony today, but based on the evidence presented, I'm prepared to issue a directed verdict in this matter. He turned to Trevor and Pierce with the kind of stern authority that had once made me proud to be part of the legal profession. The allegations of undue influence and manipulation are not only unfounded, they are insulting to the memory of Richard Stone and deeply harmful to his widow's reputation. Mrs. Stone has proven beyond any shadow of a doubt that she is not only competent to inherit her husband's estate, but deserving of it through 2 decades of devotion and sacrifice. His gaze shifted to me, and I saw respect there. The kind of respect one legal professional shows another. Furthermore, the evidence of financial irresponsibility and emotional manipulation on the part of Trevor Stone is overwhelming. I find in favor of Mrs. Stone on all counts, and I order Trevor Stone to repay the $137,000 in loans, plus interest calculated at the current federal rate. Trevor's world was ending, but mine was just beginning again. Judge Margaret Stone was back, and justice had been served. 6 months after the trial, I stood in my new law office, looking out at the city skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. The brass nameplate on my door read, Margaret Stone, Attorney at Law. It felt right in a way nothing had felt right in 20 years. The inheritance case had made headlines throughout the legal community, not just for the dramatic courtroom revelation, but for what happened afterward. Within weeks of the verdict, I'd received dozens of calls from women in similar situations. Widows whose stepchildren were contesting wills, wives whose families dismissed them as just housewives, women who'd sacrificed careers for love and found themselves fighting for respect in their later years. I'd started taking cases again, slowly at first. Pro bono work for women who couldn't afford the kind of high-powered attorneys their opponents could hire. Word spread quickly through the community that Judge Margaret Stone was back, and she was fighting for the underestimated and overlooked. My secretary knocked gently on the door. Mrs. Stone, your 3 o'clock appointment is here. Send her in, please. The woman who entered was in her early 60s, well-dressed but nervous, clutching her purse like a shield. I recognized the look immediately. It was the same expression I'd worn walking into that courtroom 6 months ago. Mrs. Morrison, please, have a seat. She settled into the chair across from my desk, her hands trembling slightly. I'm not sure you can help me, Mrs. Stone. My situation is complicated. I leaned back in my chair, studying her face. Mrs. Morrison, I've learned that the most complicated situations often have the simplest solutions. Tell me what's happening. My husband died 3 months ago. We were married for 18 years. His second marriage, my first. His children from his first marriage are claiming I brainwashed him into changing his will. They're saying I'm just a gold digger who married an older man for his money. The familiar story settled over me like an old song I'd heard too many times. And what's the truth? She looked up at me with eyes full of pain. The truth is that I gave up my nursing career when his first wife died and he needed help raising his teenage daughters. I spent 15 years trying to be a mother to girls who hated me for not being their biological mother. I nursed him through diabetes, through heart surgery, through depression after his business failed. And now they want to paint me as some kind of predator. I nodded, making notes on a yellow legal pad. Do you have documentation of your contributions to the household? Financial records, medical records, anything that shows your involvement in his care? I kept everything. Receipts, medical appointments, bank statements showing my nursing salary going toward household expenses. I even have letters he wrote to me about how grateful he was for my sacrifices. I smiled, feeling the familiar thrill of a winnable case. Mrs. Morrison, I think we're going to get along very well. As she left an hour later, armed with a legal strategy and renewed confidence, I reflected on how much my life had changed. The grief over Richard's death was still there. It probably always would be, but it no longer defined me. I'd found purpose again, a reason to get up each morning that went beyond just surviving. My phone buzzed with a text message. The caller ID made my stomach tighten. Trevor. Can we talk? I've been thinking about what you said in court. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. Coffee. Tomorrow at 10. Brewster's on 5th Street. The next morning, I arrived at the coffee shop early and chose a table near the window where I could watch for Trevor's approach. When he finally appeared, I was struck by how different he looked. Gone was the arrogant swagger, the expensive suit, the smirk that had infuriated me for 20 years. He looked older, humbled, like a man who'd been forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about himself. He spotted me and approached hesitantly, as if unsure of his welcome. Marcia, thank you for agreeing to see me. I gestured to the chair across from me. Sit down, Trevor. He ordered coffee, and we sat in uncomfortable silence until it arrived. Finally, he cleared his throat. I owe you an apology, more than an apology. I owe you. I don't know what I owe you. I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or ulterior motive. What I saw instead was genuine remorse, and something I'd never seen from him before. Humility. You don't owe me anything, Trevor. Your father already paid all the debts that mattered. He winced. That video he made, watching it, hearing him talk about me like that, it was like seeing myself through someone else's eyes for the first time. And what did you see? He stared into his coffee cup. A spoiled, entitled brat who threw away 20 years of trying to earn love I never deserved in the first place. I felt something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but something softer than the anger I'd carried for so long. Trevor, you were 12 years old when I married your father. 12-year-olds don't know how to process grief or how to make room for new people in their hearts. I never expected you to love me immediately. But I never tried, he said, his voice breaking. Not once in 20 years did I ever really try. And the worst part is, I can see now that you never stopped trying with me. We sat in silence for several minutes. Outside the window, life in the city continued its normal rhythm. People hurrying to work, couples holding hands, the endless dance of human connection and disconnection. What happens now? He asked finally. I took a sip of my coffee, considering the question. Now you figure out who you want to be going forward. The trust fund your father established will give you $24,000 a year for life. It's not enough to live extravagantly, but it's enough to supplement a reasonable income while you find your way. He nodded. I got a job. Nothing fancy. Bookkeeping for a small accounting firm. But it's honest work. And they don't know about the trust fund or the lawsuit or any of it. I'm just Trevor Stone, the guy who shows up on time and does his job. Something in his tone told me this was significant progress. How does that feel? Terrifying and liberating. I've never had to be responsible for myself before. Dad was always there to bail me out, and I knew it. Even when I was angry at him, I knew he'd never really let me fail completely. I found myself genuinely curious about this version of Trevor, the one who wasn't performing arrogance or entitlement. And now? Now I have to succeed or fail on my own merits. It's the first time in my life I've ever really tried to earn something instead of just expecting it to be given to me. We talked for another hour, carefully navigating 20 years of hurt and misunderstanding. It wasn't forgiveness. That would take time if it came at all. But it was a beginning. A recognition that we were both different people than we'd been in that courtroom 6 months ago. As we prepared to leave, Trevor hesitated. "Marcia, there's something else. I've been going to therapy, trying to understand why I was so angry for so long, and I realized something." I waited. "I wasn't angry at you for taking Dad's love away from me. I was angry at you for showing me what real love looked like and realizing I'd never learned how to give it." The words hit me like a physical blow. After 20 years of believing Trevor hated me, the truth was somehow more devastating. He'd been afraid of me. "Trevor, I watched you take care of him when he was sick. I watched you put his needs first, always. I watched you sacrifice things you wanted for things we needed. And I knew I wasn't capable of that kind of selflessness. It made me feel small and selfish, and instead of trying to grow into someone better, I just resented you for being everything I wasn't." I felt tears pricking at my eyes. "You were a child, Trevor. You weren't supposed to know how to love like that yet. But I'm not a child anymore. And if there's any chance at all, that we could figure out how to be a family, even this late, even after everything I've done, I'd like to try." I looked at this man who'd been my stepson for 20 years, but had never really been my family. And I saw something I'd never seen before. Genuine vulnerability. Genuine desire to change. "It would take time," I said carefully. "There's a lot of hurt to work through. I have time, and if you're willing, I'd like to start with getting to know the woman who was important enough for my father to change his entire will to protect." I stood to leave, slinging my purse over my shoulder. At the door, I turned back. "Trevor, your father loved you. He never stopped loving you, not even when he was disappointed in you. I hope you know that." His eyes filled with tears. "I'm starting to." 6 months later, I stood in the same courtroom where everything had changed, this time representing a 72-year-old woman whose stepchildren were trying to have her declared incompetent. The opposing counsel was young, cocky, clearly believing this would be an easy victory against an elderly widow. They had no idea who they were dealing with. As I rose to deliver my opening statement, I felt the full weight of my authority, my experience, and my purpose settle around me like armor. I was Judge Margaret Stone, attorney at law, protector of the underestimated and defender of the dismissed. And I was exactly where I belonged. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," I began, my voice carrying the confidence of a woman who'd found her way back to herself. "This case is about more than an inheritance. It's about a society that assumes a woman's worth diminishes with age, that believes a widow's grief makes her an easy target for exploitation." I paused, letting my eyes sweep across the courtroom. Today, we're going to prove them wrong. Behind me, in the gallery, sat Mrs. Morrison, whose case I'd won 3 months earlier. Next to her was Mrs. Chen, the neighbor who'd testified against me but had later become one of my strongest advocates. And in the back row, wearing a simple suit and looking nervous but proud, sat Trevor. My family. Not the one I'd been born into or married into, but the one I'd built through battle, through loss, through the decision to stop hiding who I really was. The phoenix had risen from the ashes, and she was ready to fight. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.